I want to know why Africa can't rise to become a strong and powerful continent. And apparently, an MIT study reveals why Africa is still poor. This is from Economics Explained. Go follow them, okay? And it just says, not what you think. So, whatever you're thinking is not going to be that, okay? Let's have a look what it might be then.
This video is sponsored
straight
by
ad right there.
BetterHelp.
Straight ad. I wasn't expecting
Africa is the poorest
that.
continent in the world, and as economic centres in Asia fully develop, it's unfortunately only falling further behind.
Yeah.
Today, the majority of people in the world living on less than $1 a day live in Africa, and the income
Crazy.
gap between a large share of African nations and developed nations has grown to a factor of 40 or 50. Now, addressing an entire continent as a single economic case study is normally a silly endeavour.
That's like calling a country in Europe, Europe.
There are 54 countries in Africa, each with their own economic systems, governments, challenges, and opportunities.
Sure.
Asking sweeping questions about the economy of all of them at the same time would be like assuming that the USA and Ecuador had the same economic dynamics. But when it comes to poverty, this is a relatively universal problem across all of Africa. Yes, there are outliers like the Seychelles, Mauritius, and even Botswana, but most of their economic output is unstable at best and based on dubious tax systems. Even then, the nation with the highest GDP per capita on the continent would be lower middle income in Europe or North America. This makes the question of why is Africa poor even more important to answer. The fact that most countries across the continent are undeveloped led a team of economists from MIT to look for underlying reasons that go deeper than individual national issues to see if there are common barriers to economic development in Africa that
Those are the guys that won the Nobel Prize of Economics.
are not present
I think.
in other regions around the world. Finding and understanding these issues, if they exist, has the potential to guide economic policy and aid efforts to address the root of the problem rather than band-aiding over the symptoms. So, what were the foundational issues, if any, that the MIT researchers found when trying to answer this question? How can these issues be fixed? And finally, is there any reason for optimism on what is otherwise a fairly disheartening problem? While the economy of an entire country requires thousands of people to manage, you might feel a little overwhelmed just trying to manage your own life all by yourself. I, for one, got a bit lost last year and resolved that this year I would tackle my problems head on, and I don't know if I would have had the confidence to do that without talking to my excellent therapist I found through the sponsor of this video, BetterHelp.
Good
After
for
I
you,
matched with
bro.
one of BetterHelp's 30,000 licensed therapists, we talked about setting more manageable goals using the SMART framework, that is specific, manageable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. This helped to make big seeming problems smaller, and even just having someone to talk to regularly just to check in with myself has made all the difference in the world. You just answer a few simple questions and you'll be matched with a therapist in most cases within 48 hours. And you can schedule your therapy sessions at a convenient time for you and from the comfort of your own home. And whether you're feeling a bit lost like I was, or you just want to have more confidence in the face of adversity, with BetterHelp's therapists, you can work on what matters to you. So give yourself the gift of mental clarity and reduce your feelings of overwhelm by going to betterhelp.com/EE to get
Sign up
10%
there.
off your first month. Also linked in the description, and you'll also be supporting this channel at no additional.
I think it's actually quite beautiful. I think this is a net benefit for the world. One of those, these days we hear so much negative stuff, and this one is just quite a peaceful thing to hear about. It's just, some people just getting some damn help. I'm sure not everything is perfect there, but whatever. It's just nice.
Cost
Sign
to
up
you.
if you need it.
Economic success tends to lead to more economic success, and economic challenges unfortunately do the same. Today, countries across Africa deal with a combination of problems that the world is perhaps overly familiar with. Political instability, corruption, and the destruction of capital makes it riskier for industries to get established on the continent, which means that people don't have access to economically valuable opportunities, which causes impoverished populations, which causes even more political instability. There are modern problems on top of this as well. As the world has opened up to international trade and workers, it's become harder for African industries to compete and easier for talented African workers to leave to find better opportunities in richer countries.
Yeah, there was I remember watching this on this channel actually, where a professor at some university explains how pulling the best of the best from other countries that need these people is not helping the country at all. And so when this brain drain happens for this country, where the best of the best nurses, doctors, or whatever, engineers leave the country, I mean, what are you doing for that country? I understand why they do it, and I don't blame them. And the issue is that the country itself doesn't have good institutions to allow for them to be rewarded for their excellence in some sense. And at the same time, if everyone remained, would it have gotten better? I don't know. I'm just saying that, like, in the end, this problem is patchwork stuff, right? It doesn't solve the underlying issues of the country. It's a shame.
These issues are well documented and well understood, but they are symptoms of other underlying problems. So why has Africa so universally continued to struggle with this vicious cycle where countries in every other continent around the world haven't had the same issues or have been able to address them? A good start would be geography. Almost like a real-time strategy game, where countries exist on a map does have an impact on their early game development. Land is one of the factors of production alongside labour and capital, but in a way it's almost the foundational factor of production because even in the earliest civilizations spanning back thousands of years, good land could support more people. The more people were supported by the land, the more they could specialise in technical areas of a society outside of just hunting, gathering or farming for food to survive. Now, obviously Africa is massive, but land in the economic sense also extends to other aspects of geography as well, like how fertile that land is.
Africa is massive, massive. Have you seen a real map? Real map of the world. Like not the bullshit you've been seeing in your school. The true size of. Let's see it. Come on, give me one. I think it's this one, if I'm not mistaken. It's something like this. Or yeah, this is an interesting one too. Look at that, if you lay it flat. I mean, look at Africa. Look at Africa. Even if you put it like this, look at Africa. That is insanity. Come on. Where is it? Look at this. How, like, it's almost all of this if you lay it sideways. This is incredible. And what's the normal map? Map of the world. I'll show you how they try to mess with your head here. A normal map of the world, I guess something like this. Should be this one. Come on, show me. Open image and whatever. Look here. Look how small. Look how small Africa looks compared to all of this. And then you go here. Sorry. Look at the difference. Africa. How much space? This? Yeah. Just so you know, man. Just so you know. Okay.
Is access to drinking water, and in the late game, access to raw materials and trade routes. Anytime economists look at the poverty experienced in Africa, they almost without fail mention the abundance of natural resources that exists across the continent. From precious metals, fossil fuels, diamonds, and even rare earths that have become vital to the electrification of the global economy. The trillions of dollars buried in the continent's soil makes the poverty all the more heartbreaking because while the land is so abundant in this respect, that same land has worked against the people that inhabit it for thousands of years and have put them in a position where today, when those resources are at their most valuable, they are ill-equipped to take advantage of them. The most obvious place to start is simply how isolated most of the continent has been. The Sahara Desert divides the continent east to west, and for most of human history has effectively acted as a large ocean, making most of the land to the south an island physically separated from a lot of the societal developments that took place along the trading routes between Europe, the Middle East and Asia. Even today, the countries in northern Africa along the Mediterranean are more integrated into global affairs and are generally more developed than countries in the south and centre of the continent. The Sahara Desert is such an economically significant geographic feature that economists will often look at northern Africa and sub-Saharan Africa as two completely separate entities. Both have their problems, but sub-Saharan Africa's tends to be long-standing. Being isolated from even early global trade and the spread of ideas and technology put the south of the continent behind their northern neighbours, and it would also later open them up to exploitation from technologically superior regions that would establish connections to the continent in ways that were not mutually beneficial, to put it mildly. Beyond that, the land itself is not particularly fertile. Making the transition to productive agriculture is one of the most significant things humanity has ever done. But it was obviously easier to take that step where the land was more naturally fertile. The Sahara Desert clearly isn't ideal for farming, but even the most seemingly fertile lands in the centre of the continent have poor soil quality that is prone to rapid erosion unless it's carefully managed by even the most advanced modern farming techniques. An ancient civilization would have found it very hard to develop agriculture given these factors, and there was also no real incentive to.
I mean, unless you're the aliens that built the pyramids, right?
In lush areas where agriculture would have been possible, it was just easier to forage or hunt for food, rather than invest the effort into developing farms. Sub-Saharan Africa is also an environment that is very inhospitable to structured development. The most fertile areas are rife with tropical diseases, insects and wildlife that generally favour human groups that remain spread out and mobile. Anthropologists compare this with theories they have around other early developments that revolve around something they call the trap of sedentism. This is where human groups would find an area so lush with life and abundant in resources that were important to early humans like fresh water, wood and the lack of predators, that they would just become sedentary in that area for generations until they depleted everything they could hunt or gather. At that point, agriculture becomes the only option if the group has lost their nomadic ways. These Gardens of Eden, as anthropologists call it, didn't really exist in Africa, so people had to stay in smaller groups and they had to keep moving. Today, this has resulted in a continent that has many different ethnic groups that speak hundreds of languages and have very different cultural norms. Even though the continent is divided amongst a lot of different countries, those countries themselves are often individually divided between many different groups. The large number of haphazardly drawn borders also causes other economic problems too. Yes, this is in large part still thanks to the shadow left by colonialism, but we still need to get to that. As it relates to just using the land as a factor of production for economic development, this dense cobweb of borders also means that many countries are cut off from the outside world because they don't have access to oceans for international trade. Transport infrastructure for trade is very minimal, and what does exist is either far from fully developed or are leftover rail tracks from colonial empires that are falling into disrepair and were only set up in the first place with the intention of exploiting resources rather than building an independent economy. The connections between countries are often at best dirt roads, and even those that are lucky enough to be directly on the ocean for a chance at getting involved in global trade still have other major geographic barriers. Most of the African coast, especially in the west, is raised and completely impractical to develop major shipping ports around. So before humans even existed, Africa was far from an ideal spawn location for mid to late game economic development. These challenges also influence the other factors of production, including one that we rarely mention on this channel. Macroeconomists frequently talk about the way that land, labour and capital interact to influence an economy. In the case of Africa, it had land that was less than ideal for farming, trade and industry, which meant it had a smaller, more splintered population, labour, which meant that they were less concentrated in centres of commerce, which meant that instead of developing and sharing technologies and infrastructure, capital, they focused more on just surviving. But there was also another element, and that was entrepreneurship. Now, when economists talk about entrepreneurship as a factor of production, they're not just talking about people who go out and start a business. They're more referring to people, or even institutions, that can coordinate the other factors of production, land, labour and capital, into actually doing something useful. It should be noted that a lot of economists often just bundle this together with labour, because labour also considers not just how many people are working in an economy, but what their skills are as well. A more skilled workforce should be able to produce more economic output. Given that entrepreneurship is arguably just another skill, explains why these two are often merged together. But the economic case study of Africa may be one of the clearest examples of why this is important enough to be considered as its own separate element. Now, most of this is based on the work of Darren Acemoglu and James A. Robinson from MIT in their publication simply titled, Why is Africa Poor? We were lucky enough to speak directly with Professor Acemoglu, who, on top of publishing this paper, also wrote the legendary book Why Nations Fail, all while being one of the most prolific academic researchers in the history of economics. Needless to say, it was good to get his insights on such a complex issue.
Can you understand Ukraine today without its geography? No. Its entire history, especially recently, is because of the place that it is in, next to Russia. So that's geography. And you cannot understand Saudi Arabia without its geography, meaning its endowments, oil. If Saudi Arabia didn't have oil, it would be a very different place today.
Yeah.
So there are geographic factors that matter. But the question to which James Robinson and I gave a categorical no, is geography the main factor that explains the large gaps in income per capita and in prosperity around the world? And the answer to that is no.
I love that they came to that conclusion through measured proof, I guess, in some sense. Because it would be a real shame if it was just based on your geography and has nothing to do with the human's ability to adapt or perform within that piece of land. I guess it gives humanity some sense that there is control, or things can be controlled and it can be done by a human themselves. Does it make sense? Like, it's not just we're an effect of everything and whatever happens is just because. No. I like that a lot in the economics world.
Institutions are overwhelmingly more important. You are absolutely right.
What's so more important?
Institutions are overwhelmingly more important.
Okay.
You are absolutely right. Sub-Saharan Africa is really a jarring case of poverty, failure to develop economically, failure to build industry and prosperity.
Again, even though these challenges exist, it's important to address the underlying cause of things like the slow adoption of technology. Acemoglu and Robinson in their research look back to various groups around.
It's actually crazy sometimes. And this is totally ignorant. I'm being totally ignorant now. I don't know where this is. I don't know anything about it. I just look at something like this, right? This video, and I think, wow, you have a place like Shenzhen, oh, I'm totally butchering that name, but any freaking big Chinese city, right? Take New York, compare it to something like this. And like, this is cute and all, and you should compare it more to a village perhaps, but wow, there's obviously a massive difference to what could be compared, like what has been achieved by essentially the same species, right? And not that far away. I find it mind blowing. Again, this is a completely ignorant take. I'm just saying the comparison is crazy.
On the continent and individual motivations for why they did or did not adopt certain technologies, even when they were made available to them. Even really simple technologies like a wheel weren't widely adopted. The cheap transportation that something this simple enables means that it becomes easier and easier for societies to develop outside of small village groups because resources can be traded between different areas, allowing people to specialise. If something like food, tools, or building materials need to be transported by head porterage, where people just put heavy things directly on top of their head, then that's way less efficient than even a basic handcart. At that point, it just becomes easier for societal groups to be self-sufficient because it's so hard to do trade. Now, this wasn't unique to Africa. Indigenous Australians were also largely separated from the early exchange of technologies, and they too remained as mostly self-sufficient groups of hunters and gatherers until Western colonies were established there. If that's all there was to this story, then that would explain why Africa was historically behind the empires of the North, but it wouldn't explain why they remained behind. What Acemoglu and Robinson found interesting was that even after wheels became common knowledge on the continent, the studied groups still preferred to do things by hand, and there was no clear reason why, until they looked at the institutions ruling over these areas. By the time Western technology made it to Africa, regions such as the Congo were loosely run by kings that would rule by decree with little to no oversight. They would raise revenues through arbitrary taxes and take things by force where they saw fit. This pushed groups that wanted to avoid the rule of these unchecked leaders further away from the basic roads that existed in the region, so instead of developing a culture of trade and interdependence, the tyrannical ruling institutions encouraged exactly the opposite. Fractured, self-sufficient groups have carried through to the modern day, where even within the many borders of Africa, there are often dozens of different cultural groups within a country vying for political representation and power. In this kind of environment, it's easy for bad leaders to establish themselves in positions of power by appeasing to their group and managing the country in such a way that it comes at the expense of everybody else, which means even a few hundred years later, it's risky for people to rely on the...
Why does it say 56 kilometers per hour on the back? Is that the max it can go? Horn before overtaking.
economy to provide them what they need. It might be much less efficient, but it's much safer for them to just look after themselves. It also wasn't worth putting too much effort into making even simple stuff like a handcart when it could just be seized by some absolute monarch at their whim. Now, of course, this did not happen in a vacuum, and it's impossible to look at the modern-day economic struggles of Africa without exploring conquest and colonialism. All of the challenges that the continent of Africa had with divided populations, inhospitable environments, and poor economic management was made significantly worse by the Atlantic slave trade and later colonial empires. The basic economics of the slave trade were unfortunately almost brutally simple, and preyed on a lot of the foundational weaknesses that we've been exploring so far. Colonial empires had established plantations in the newly discovered Americas, but unfortunately for them, unlike a lot of other colonies in the East Indies, the native population was dying out too quickly to be put to work growing exotic spices. So the Europeans needed to import a new labour force, and well, they weren't going to do it themselves, so they turned to Africa. A lot of the unchecked African rulers at the time already used slave labour themselves, and they were happy to participate in this horrifying industry in exchange for European technologies, particularly firearms. Guns were technically advanced tools, but unlike a lot of other technology, they didn't have the same problem with just being claimed because they were both property and a tool to enforce property rights all in one. So powerful groups could get tools to become even more powerful and profit from capturing their rivals to be sent overseas. The Europeans took this slave labour and put it to use in their new colonies to produce exotic goods to sell in Europe, and they used the proceeds to buy even more guns to sell back to Africa in exchange for more slave labour. The reason they didn't just set up colonies in Africa itself was because at this time, African groups, after a long history of fighting amongst themselves, were pretty powerful adversaries, especially on their home turf that was full of tropical diseases, dangerous animals, and below average soil anyway. It was just easier to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, which highlights just how tough Africa was to settle. Of course, this system didn't last forever. American colonies started claiming independence, and the Industrial Revolution meant that Western militaries grew far more powerful very quickly. In the 1600s, with wooden sail ships and early
What is this video game template,
firearms, it just wouldn't have been economically viable to colonise Africa, like European powers were doing with other regions around the world. But with modern armies, steamships, and basic treatments for tropical diseases, the large continent of Africa started to look very attractive as a colony, especially since it was filled with resources that were suddenly very useful in the industrial era. This time period on the continent was truly horrific, to the point where we can't go into too much detail or this video will just get taken off YouTube. But from a purely macroeconomic perspective, this laid the foundation for a lot of the government problems the continent still struggles with to this day. When colonial powers moved out of Africa, they took with them their tools, ruling structures, and industrial relations. Education on the continent was almost non-existent, and now a lot of groups couldn't even go back to their traditional way of life. Violent power grabs happened across the continent, and even if the leaders that seized power were completely benevolent, they had no training on what goes into running an effective government. Now, of course, a lot of leaders across the continent have not been benevolent, and instances of corruption, well, they've been known to happen.
At independence, some of Africa had the beginnings of a bureaucratic system, a court system, etc., that Europeans themselves had set up. But those were mostly in the main population centers, in the main urban centers. They had not penetrated society. They had not become completely legitimized. In fact, Europeans often destroyed more legitimate indigenous institutions when they tried to build their own for reasons of control. For example, the British colonizing Nigeria. They tried to introduce their own ruling families in places like Sierra Leone as well. And when they left, the skeleton of institutions were not very useful for building new economic activities, but they were very amenable for a strong man to take them over and use them for extraction.
The natural resources that should be Africa's golden ticket to economic prosperity have in many instances just been used by despotic leaders as their own personal piggy bank to secure their own power. Constant political upheaval and the continued rule of unchecked authorities means that the continent as a whole has taken a serious reputational hit, to the point where any industry across Africa is inherently seen as more risky than a similar industry in another continent. This means Africa has struggled to get funding for even basic projects with huge potential upsides because it's just considered too risky. Now, sometimes this reputation is earned. A few months ago, we looked at the conflict unfolding in Niger and how it was halting the development of an oil pipeline, one of the easiest infrastructure projects to ever see a return on investment from, but even still, in the geopolitically uncertain country, it was just not worth the risk. Now, fortunately, while this situation almost seems hopeless, there is room for optimism.
Let's hear it, because that's what we need, right?
A lot of the underlying issues with the failed development of solid institutions to manage economic development are starting to show positive signs of progress. Robinson and Acemoglu's paper was written more than 13 years ago now, and a lot has changed since then.
Botswana is one of the fastest growing countries over the last 60 years since its independence. And if you look at Botswana, it has all of the problems that others attribute to Africa. It is a landlocked country. It is not an easy country to navigate because of its richness of all sorts of natural barriers to moving around and other issues. It has diamonds, which have been called a curse for other African countries. It also started its independence period dirt poor and without much road or any type of educated elite. But it built better institutions for a variety of reasons. We can get into them if you are interested. But it built better institutions. It created stable property rights. It created a democracy that has worked reasonably well over time. It never led to a system where the court system was biased towards one group versus another. It invested in people, in education, in public infrastructure. It managed the diamond wealth well, and it's achieved this relatively high level of income.
But it will be a mixed bag and it will take some time. Interest rates across the world right now are high, which means international investors are even less attracted to places like Africa, since they can get good returns by just buying extremely safe investments. When cash is earning less than 1%, they might be a bit more motivated to look at Africa as an option again. The continent is also, again, embroiled in a number of very high-profile conflicts, which is making even countries like China take a step back and see how this all plays out. Nobody can predict the future, least of all economists, but it also must be remembered that just 50 years ago, most of Asia was in the same economic situation as most of Africa today. 300 years ago, a blink of an eye in the grand scheme of human history, even the wealthiest Western nations had a similar economic output to the continent today. One of the most poignant takeaways from Acemoglu and Robinson's research is that economic success tends to lead to more economic success. Most economies throughout history have been stagnant until they weren't. If Africa's time does come, it could be an economic success story the same as every other region that was plagued by problems until they made the first breakthrough. Our
That would be awesome. Honestly, I wholeheartedly support the growth of Africa. In some sense, I feel like we're moving all over the place. We're all trying to find a better life. And man, the country you're from should be doing well, at least to some basic standard, right? And then yeah, I are you African? Yeah, where in Africa are you from? Let's see what the
interview with
last is
Professor
here.
Asimoglu is
Spotify.
available to listen to ad-free on Spotify and every other popular music streaming platform. We briefly touched on the problem of modern-day corruption in this video, but it's something that we covered extensively in our video on Eritrea, one of the clearest examples of a struggling African.
Yeah. So yeah. Well, I'm not. All right. Let's hear. I moved to Kenya for a job, curious about living on the continent. I thought I understood corruption, but corruption in Africa is on a whole other level. Oh man. Yeah, well, insecurity and instability doesn't breed innovation and entrepreneurship, does it? Residing in Zambia, Africa, for the past 30 years, I've never experienced conflict or war. It's rare to even see a police officer with a gun where I'm from. My realization that it's corruption that continue to impede our progress and perpetuate poverty. Until our leaders prioritize the development of our nations over personal gain, obstacles to progress will persist. That makes sense. While external forces significantly contribute to corruption, which further reduces access to resources and capital that we need for development, we must eventually take responsibility for addressing and combating these issues. I hope you do. Good luck, honestly. Let's hear it. The reason is obvious. The African people are not sharing enough motivational quotes on Facebook. Guys, all you need to do is live, love, laugh, okay? Why is Africa poor? Thumbnail, not what you think. Video, exactly what you think. Exactly what you thought. Well, okay, good for you, man. Nice video, but I missed the point. Is the groundbreaking MIT conclusion that countries with less stable or robust institutions are harder to develop? The video is called MIT Studies Reveals Why Africa is Still Poor, and then kind of reveals what everyone already knows. Well, this was already responded to here, I think, in another video saying, I keep seeing comments like this seems obvious or this seems like common sense. By the way, this is also an economics video of similar topics, right? Explain why this groundbreaking correlation does not imply causation, not to mention that many other people claim other things, i.e. geography, racial supremacy, and stuff like that. Yeah, I know people, yeah, they would. These guys won the Nobel Prize because they gathered data to demonstrate causation, definitively show that trust in institutions is what leads to good economics. So it's not, I mean, I agree. This is, you hear this and you're like, oh, that's common sense. I get it. I get it. But it's now much more set in stone. And yes, I agree. I wish we could use common sense a bit more and intuition because we could get farther, sometimes faster. But it's always nice to have it set in stone. The lack of critical engagement with the quoted paper is glaring. All right. BetterHelp was exposed for being a scam a few years ago. Damn, do your own research, I guess. Corruption has been known to happen was an understatement if I ever heard one. All right. Are you African? Do you live in Africa? Where? And what do you think? And is your country doing better than the average? Are you from Botswana, for example? Are you from Nigeria? Egypt, where people get scammed all the time to visit the pyramids? Annoying. Please stop that. Anyways, let me know.